In the papacy of John Paul II, Mary's role and also his prayer of the Rosary was very much a part of his ministry. In John Paul II's coat of arms, there was a cross, and underneath the cross, under one of the arms of the horizontal arms, there was a letter M, which stood for Mary and her place in that most important time in Jesus' life when he was offering himself up to the Father. Recently, the public television station Philadelphia aired a documentary called The Pope and Communism. In the documentary, the producers presented John Paul II as a mystical figure. His actions, in a sense, changed the policy that the Polish Church had with the communist government. He didn't directly confront the government, but rather he chose ways of bringing people, both intellectuals and people who are in dissent, to come into the church, and there he offered them a place where they could dialogue and offer dissenting ideas to that which was presented by the communist government, who in a sense controlled the moral teaching of the people, their education, their work opportunities, and even the possibilities of any kind of advancement and even going to certain schools. So it was in that context that John Paul II allowed other people to have a voice. When he was elected Pope, the Polish government offered him an opportunity to visit, but the Polish episcopacy wanted him to come on this very feast, the feast of St. Stanislaus, because they were celebrating an important anniversary of his death. The government denied John Paul II the opportunity to visit on this day, but rather they said, we'll let you come in June for the celebration of Corpus Christi. It was a longer visit. Instead of a 3-day visit, the Vatican was given 9 days in which the Polish Pope would be able to travel around his native country. And there he gathered the people at the shrine of Our Lady of Czestochowa, which is the principal Marian shrine. And there the people could see that they weren't alone. Oftentimes in the communist government, there were spies who were among the people, and so you couldn't speak freely. People felt very much isolated. They couldn't find people of similar beliefs or similar understandings as them. But in that visit, the people could see that there were not only just a few people who had great conviction and desire to change things in Poland, but rather that there were millions of people who stood on the side of freedom, and especially freedom of religion. Pope John Paul II would tell the people, do not be afraid, and to trust in Mary's care for them. It's very similar to the words that Mary shared with Juan Diego in an apparition of Our Lady of Guadalupe, where she told the poor peasant Juan Diego, do not be afraid. And she encouraged him, saying, am I not your mother? So it's in that spirit of trust in Mary's maternal care that the people are able to overcome their sense of fear before the power of the communist regime. On his papal visit to many different countries, John Paul II would have a public prayer of the Rosary. Sometimes he would invite priests, sometimes the general public, sometimes he would pray with seminarians. He encouraged also families to pray the Rosary as a way of coming closer to Mary and to drawing closer as a family. One person who was very much influenced by John Paul II's prayer and fidelity to Mary was a priest by the name of Father Jorge Bergoglio, the present Pope Francis. It was on a visit to Buenos Aires in 1985 that Father Bergoglio attended Pope John Paul II's recitation of the Rosary. He was moved by the depth of faith that John Paul II expressed, his contemplation of the mysteries of the Rosary, and his great fidelity to that devotion. And from that day forward, Father Bergoglio made a promise that he would pray the 15 decades of the Rosary, which he does as Pope Francis to the present day. Now, the prayer of these two exceptional popes is evidence that Mary gives herself to us and she helps us in our vocation. A young woman was also once challenged by the message of Our Lady of Fatima, where she read that one of the encouragement that Mary gives to all those who follow Jesus is that they should adopt the daily prayer of the Rosary. Her name was Megan O'Regan, and she writes the following. 10 years ago, I read about Our Lady's request at Fatima that we say a daily rosary. At first, I flinched at the notion of saying one every day. I thought it impossible. I'd never have the time, the concentration, or the patience to meditate on 5 decades each day. But it got easier. Even now, after I have worked 12-hour shifts and struggled to fit in the 5 decades, I still manage it, even if I forfeit sleep or a social occasion or have to eat a late dinner and pray the Rosary at the same time. We pray the Rosary in order that we might be more convinced of our vocations. Jesus is calling each one of us to a certain mission, to a certain kind of life, to be more faithful, to be more loving. There's one story that is apropos to this celebration of the Feast of St. Stanislaus. A number of years ago, about 14 years ago, I was on a visitation of the Polish province with one of our confreres. His name was Janusz Zwolenski. He was a Vincentian priest. And one day at a lunch conversation, they spoke about the fact that when Janusz was ordained a priest, he broke the curse. And I said, what curse was that? He said, the curse that concerned the fact that from this small town of Rakowice, that there would, near Krakow, that there would be no vocation. And as he explained, what happened was that in this small village of Rakowice, the knight that had executed Saint Stanislaus, that's where his home was. And so this knight who killed Saint Stanislaus, having come from this village, the people said that from now on there'd be no vocations. And in fact, there was none for several hundred years until Father Janusz was ordained a local resident from Rakowice. So in one sense, the prayer of the Church, the prayer of Mary, helps us to overcome great barriers, even in places where there's little faith, or perhaps you might even feel cursed, that there's an opening that Mary has to supporting vocations and to helping us enter into our commitments. Mary's Rosary contains a very important but basic attitude of the Christian faithful, namely one of praise and worship to God as Creator. Mary's prayer of the Rosary and our joining in that prayer helps us to draw closer to God, who is Trinity. And in one of the papal documents, we read the following: with this attitude, which encompasses her entire life, the Blessed Virgin indicates the high road of listening to the word of the Lord. It is an essential element of worship, which has become typical of the Christian liturgy. Her example shows us that worship does not primarily consist in expressing human thoughts and feelings, but in listening to the divine word in order to know it, to assimilate it, and to put it into practice daily in our lives. And finally, I believe that Mary and the prayer of the Rosary allows us to overcome the many challenges that we have in life, both personally and the challenges that our families face. Pope Francis has a favorite devotion. It's to Our Lady of the Knots. Pope Francis discovered that devotion in the 1980s when he went over to study in Germany. And there in the Church of St. Peter am Perlach in Augsburg, there's an image of the Blessed Virgin Mary. She's standing with her feet on the head of Satan, and she has a long ribbon, and in this ribbon there are many knots, and she's patiently untying these knots, which is the knot of Eve's disobedience, and also the knots that we find ourselves in because of sin, because of our own ignorance, and because of the ignorance and the immaturity of others. And Mary dedicates herself to all these different problems, untying them as the faithful presented to them. We may come to this shrine with many different problems, with challenges. And when we place our prayers before Mary, they become easier. The burdens become, in a sense, untied. About 5 months ago, when we were here at the shrine, I asked one of the women who comes here faithfully, I said, "What draws you to the shrine?" And she says, "Well, I come here oftentimes burdened, but I leave always with the sense that my prayers are heard and that my burdens have been lightened." In closing, the Rosary is meant for the family and for the benefit of our families. It can be prayed either alone or with others. If prayed within the family context, it serves to bring the family members closer to one another and to Jesus Christ. However, it must be said with great faith and love. The prayer of the Memorare, I believe, sums up the faith that we have in Mary's intercession, where we read, "Never was it known that anyone who fled to your protection was left unaided." Recently, I came across a prayer which expresses this similar attitude, but places love at the center. And the prayer reads, "Love never tires of taking the initiative to sacrificially give its best for the well-being of others, regardless of who they are or how they respond to us. To pray to Mary is like finding a friend who can reciprocate our love, and in fact, she even surpasses it with her fidelity. Because of her love, Mary is with us, but also she runs ahead of us, working to solve our problems. Our consolation consists in spending time with Mary and becoming her friends and entering into her prayer of the Rosary."